Borrowing costs in the UK spiked even higher this morning as the pound continued to fall, putting the Chancellor under renewed pressure as markets sounded the alarm over lower growth and higher inflation.
Right, Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, Mel Strike.
Where is the Chancellor?
This was the urgent question from the Shadow Chancellor as MPs piled in to ask whether higher borrowing costs meant the government had run out of money.
In the last 48 hours, borrowing costs have reached a 27-year high. And despite what the Right Honourable Gentleman says about international factors, with these rising costs, regrettably the government may now be on course to breach their fiscal rules.
There should be no doubt of the government's commitment to economic stability and sound public finances. This is why meeting the fiscal rules is non-negotiable.
The Chief Secretary denied there was any crisis and assured members that the gilt markets were orderly. But not all MPs were convinced, even those on Labour benches.
And what notice he will give to departments about extra cuts that they may have to make in order to meet the fiscal rules. And in addition, will the Chancellor now, when she comes in front of the House for the OBR forecast in March, be making a fiscal statement at that point?
While markets regained some composure, the Chancellor boarded her plane to Beijing. The government is trying to boost trade and reignite the so-called golden age of Chinese diplomacy, championed by George Osborne, David Cameron, and even while Mayor Boris Johnson.
Would you believe that? We have tea that is grown in China, packaged in Britain and exported back to China.
As we get closer to a new Trump presidency and his tariffs, Britain is trying to walk a tightrope of economic opportunism and political peril. And with the fiscal picture at home so fragile, the hunt for growth is even more imperative. Will the Chancellor's trip to China make any difference?
None at all. There is a delusion that in order to sell more things to China, in order to get the Chinese to invest more here, we have to bend the knee. We have to go along with their political narrative about what's happening in the world. And there is so much experience that that's complete bilge that it's a pity that you endlessly find yourself contending with the argument and dealing with the sort of mush school of diplomacy.
Lord Patten was the last governor of Hong Kong. He agrees China's economy matters, but says the British government mustn't forget about imprisoned democracy campaigner Jimmy Lai, or claims of increased surveillance against Hong Kong activists now living here.
Do the Chinese invest in Britain out of a sort of act of corporate charity? Are they like a branch of the St. Vincent Society? Not remotely.
Do we matter to them economically, or are we just a tool in their US relations?
Both those things are true. They matter because of their trade surplus with us. They would like to invest in some strategic areas which will give them some political clout in the future. But their total investments in the UK are 0.2% of our total foreign direct investment. 0.2%. This isn't going to rescue the British economy.
But the Chancellor's going with a whole gaggle of bankers. She's taking along the Bank of England governor, the boss of HSBC.
I'm sure.
Do you think
it's what I call show business? Mush has taken over. And what annoys me, it's not just how demeaning our behaviour is, but it so annoys me that there is no evidential basis for being on our knees when we deal with China. You shouldn't be prepared to bury the things which you allegedly believe in, or to think you can only deal with those in a sort of subterranean way. By the way, footnote in the minutes of the meeting. If that's your attitude to standing up for your principles, then God help us all.
The political headwinds of doing business with China could also provoke trade barriers with President Trump. In Beijing, Reeves will visit British exporters like Brompton Bikes as she works to get the UK back into gear and boost Chinese investment on domestic shores. Her high wire act now increasingly precarious at home and abroad.
Well, a short time ago, I spoke to the economist Rupert Harrison, who was Chief of Staff to former Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne. He stood for the Conservatives in last year's general election. I began by asking him how tight of a spot Rachel Reeves is currently in.
Well, she is in a difficult situation because she's caught up in a global market storm. This is, let's be clear, this is not just about the UK. There is a global focus in markets on inflation, particularly in the US. Their markets are worried that inflation hasn't gone away, that Donald Trump may be about to reignite it with tariffs and tax cuts in the US. And the problem for the UK is that it has been particularly badly affected because it's a bit like a beauty parade, and the UK looks like one of the uglier countries in the beauty parade at the moment because our borrowing is very high, inflation is quite persistent, and our growth is very low.
Well, the fact that you've described the UK as one of the ugliest countries in the beauty parade, how much of that then is self-inflicted because of the moves that Rachel Reeves has made since Labour was elected?
Look, it's partly inherited, but a large part of it is self-inflicted. Look, partly it's just after the experience of COVID and the energy crisis and the financial crisis. Even many years before that, the UK is now a relatively high debt economy, and so we are more vulnerable. But that is worse because at the budget, Rachel Reeves deliberately decided to borrow, not just tax an extra 40 billion a year, but to borrow an extra 30 billion a year. That was a deliberate decision. And markets are now looking at those borrowing projections and thinking, that's actually quite a lot of borrowing, and actually we don't really want to fund it, and you're going to have to pay us a lot more.
Well, the Treasury has signalled that if there are adjustments that need to be made, that would come in the form, most likely, of spending cuts. How doable do you think that is, given a lot of public services look pretty threadbare already?
Well, there certainly is room to cut, given that the Chancellor added a lot of spending at the budget. I mean, it's embarrassing to do a budget and then a few months later have to come back and trim your numbers.
You're very familiar with austerity, having advised George Osborne when he was Chancellor. Are we looking at a new age of austerity then?
No, we're not, because fundamentally public spending has been pretty much steady as a share of GDP for some time, and it's now going to be rising strongly in real terms after the decisions in the budget to add to spending, particularly that big upfront injection into the NHS. But no, I don't think that this is about a new era of austerity. It's really about, were the Chancellor's decisions to deliberately go out and borrow more a sensible approach in this age where interest rates are high and rising? In effect, it's a strategy that was born out of the last decade when we had very low interest rates, and the idea, I think, set in parts of the Labour Party that borrowing was costless and we could just go out and borrow whatever we wanted. The problem is we're not in that world anymore. We're in a world where interest rates are high, inflation hasn't gone away, and that borrowing is just more expensive and more risky than it used to be.
We're hearing terrible reports about the strain on the NHS at the moment. If you were in the government at the moment advising the Chancellor, would you really be advising her she can't put any more money into the NHS?
Well, my concern would actually be that the amount of money that's going into the NHS right now is too front-loaded and it's going to be spent badly. So I would much prefer, from the point of view of improving productivity in the NHS, a more gradual increase, much more tied to reform. And instead, we've seen the money before we've heard anything about reform. So I think that's the problem.
The former Prime Minister Liz Truss wrote a legal letter to Keir Starmer accusing him of false and defamatory claims that she crashed the economy. Would you have advised her to keep quiet?
I certainly would. I think that is generally the best advice to Liz Truss at all times, but particularly now. And I think the rule here is if you're in a hole, stop digging.
Well, she says that Rachel Reeves has pushed Britain to the brink of economic crisis.
Well, look, I just think that it's about the messenger rather than the message, and I don't think she is the most credible messenger for any message, particularly from the Conservative Party.
But would you also dispute that message that Rachel Reeves has pushed the economy to the brink?
Well, look, I think that Rachel Reeves has made the UK more vulnerable. Look, we are not in, right now, a full-blown economic crisis. These are market concerns. It's a signal that we live in riskier times and the government needs to look again at its borrowing plans.
Rupert Harrison, thanks very much.